We're on.
Excuse me. Good afternoon. If there are empty seats around the table, perhaps, and it is not a named seat, then take it. We will be talking here on the topic of catching up with the digital era, and I'm Toomas Ilves, and I'm president of Estonia, at least for a little while more. So when we talk about catching up, I mean, I think that it's already a good step that we recognize we need to catch up. While in some cases we can pat ourselves on the back and say that, well, we have all kinds of numbers about 315 million Europeans using the internet every day, some of the fastest broadband, highest rate of connectivity, but we are still, nonetheless, falling behind. Of the 20 largest IT companies in the world, 14 are American and the rest are Chinese. So I think that says something about what we need to change and what we have to look at. To give you an idea of what we face and why, I will get to why I think it's all very important in a moment, but as president I have this habit of when I see some very promising young people, I invite them for tea. And I read in the newspaper about a young man, at the time he was 24, who had gotten $300,000 for a startup idea he had. And so I invited him to tea, and it was all very nice. And then he said, but I'm sorry, Mr. President, in 2 weeks I'm moving to the United States. I said, why are you doing that? He goes, well, look at, I mean, the Estonian market isn't very big, nor is even the German market is 1/4 of the size of the US market. And besides, capital is almost impossible to get for startups. So he moved to the United States, and 6 months later, he had already raised $6 million. So that was 6 months into being in there. And last October, when he had been gone for 4 years, he sold his startup for $100 million. I think that sort of sums up one of the problems we face. In an era when we're looking at migration and refugees coming to Europe, we are also losing our best and brightest, and we are sadly lacking in really active business in IT. I mentioned this to Neelie Cruz last year, right before she left her position, where she was working on the same issue, and she mentioned that in Portugal she visited an incubator where there were 45 companies, all startups, and every single one, she said that as soon as they get some startup money, they're moving to the US. Now, well, how does the United States differ from the European Union? Well, in one critical way. There are probably many reasons, but one which is most salient for this topic is that they have a single digital market. Electronic services move across state borders, and they are widely available everywhere. In Europe, we have 28 separate markets. We may have the Single Market Act, which works for material goods, but these days, the way we are, it is far easier for anyone to ship a bottle of wine from the Algarve in southern Portugal and sell it up north in Lapland, north of the Arctic Circle, than it is to buy give a gift of an iTunes record across the shortest border. I mean, you can't even do it between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So that means that our economies are not developing at the rapid rates that the United States has, thanks to the fact that they do have a single market, and the EU, the Commission has calculated that it is we are falling behind at a rate of 0.3% of GDP for EU per year. And since there are probably some bankers here, you can do the compound interest on that and figure out how much that will mean in 10 years. So this is a problem. I mean, why do we not have a single market? Well, part of it is, I mean, it has to do with a whole series of issues. First of all, we have 28 separate copyright regimes. We have all these different tax regimes. There's an unwillingness on certain on certain services. There is an antipathy in Europe for services moving across borders. And so the total annual cost to Europe due to a fractured digital market is estimated to be about 340 billion euros a year. And so we have that problem, the economies are not developing as rapidly as they should. We have a brain drain simply because the environment here in Europe is not sufficient to allow allow startups to prosper here, and they do in fact move away. So now, speaking as a country which, among other things, produced Skype, and where the hottest thing right now, there's an article every week or so about TransferWise is another Estonian startup that is now valued at €1 billion, and they simply they've taken advantage of the few things you can do with the digital market, but even there they have to negotiate separate agreements with every single European country in order to revolutionize financial services, or more accurately, transfers of money from one country to another. Now, the final thing, let's say two things. One is that, I mean, to bring it to some larger issues. First of all, I hope some people at least here know what Moore's law is. It's that the power of a computing chip will double every 1.5 years, more or less. And that means that if we go protectionist here, as we have been, that means that we will not fall behind linearly, as say if you have protectionism in the automobile industry, we'll fall back exponentially. And I told some European parliamentarians last year that, well, you have 4.5 years left, and that means that you will be, when you are up for election again, that'll be 3 iterations of Moore's law, which means that a computer chip will be 2 to the 3rd times more powerful. And one of the problems then came in a question I was asked, what is 2 to the 3rd? I mean, if our lawmakers do not have sufficient knowledge of math, science, and the possibilities of modern technology, then we have what C.P. Snow described at Cambridge University in a wonderful essay 55 years ago called The Two Cultures, where he discovered he was the one person as a physical chemist and a literary novelist who could talk to the writers and poets, or drink with the writers and poets, and eat with the physicists and the chemists. And he wrote this essay called The Two Cultures, which he described the university. I would argue that we face, in our least democratic societies, the problem of the two cultures writ large. We have geeks who figure out bigger and better ways to do all kinds of things, often very lucrative things, sometimes not so nice with respect to human rights or privacy. And then we have a culture of lawmakers and judges who have not really studied math in the last 30 or 40 years. And so we have to bridge this gap more broadly. That's an education issue. And the other big issue that I think we face, which in my own arguments with populists in Eastern Europe, is that with the current climate towards foreigners that we see developing in a number of countries, IT companies will leave those countries, because as it is, we have a labor shortage in IT. We're going to have people from the Indian subcontinent. We have lots of them working in our IT companies, and if the climate that we see developing in some countries continues the way it is, then the IT companies themselves will depart and go to places that are more tolerant. But that's some even broader social issue that I wanted to raise. Now I'm going to hand it over, after my far too long introduction, to my co-host here, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hello, everybody. I'm Wouter Verschelden. I'm a founder and publisher of a news website, NewsMonkey. Before I delve into my my expose, thank you so much for setting the stage. I was actually hoping I was going to be the more gloomy person of the two introducing this panel, but I'm afraid that's going to be a bit tough. just to set the rules, we're going to have each of the three experts explaining themselves for 5 minutes. That should be short, and then we want you to jump in and have as much discussion, and actually as much recommendations and good advice or things that our politicians, our leaders should do, because we want to make this as tangible as possible. Now, I want to tell you a bit my own personal story. I'm a journalist. I used to be a classic editor-in-chief of a Belgian national newspaper, De Morgen, with all the challenges and all the problems that go along with media nowadays when you run on paper and you know half of your population is digitalizing, Generation Y isn't reading paper anymore. And I made the decision, I want to be in that business for the rest of my life, so I need to change it. I need to change what I'm doing, and then we left some other co-founders and started a totally digital website, a news channel for a younger generation. But if I look at our policymakers, if I look at Europe, I'm really scared about the lack of support, actually the lack of mental framework on how fast things are evolving, how fast the Americans and the Chinese, as you mentioned, Mr. President, are jumping in my business of media, are overtaking a lot of what we do. Fundamentally, journalism is something that will prevail, will survive. I'm very convinced about that, but we're no longer setting the stage, and that's a key fundamental problem. Let me make that very tangible, and then I'll jump to the experts. For me, for example, the whole discussion of net neutrality, basically level playing field for everybody. If there wouldn't have been net neutrality, something like my NewsMonkey wouldn't have been possible, and startups on the digital era are not going to be possible if we let go of that fundamental principle of everybody's equal online. So yes, I'm scared about that. Enough of us. Let's jump to the experts, and we're going to start with Amit Sood, who is the head of the Google Cultural Institute, and we're very glad to have him on our panel. Amit.
Just going to try and show you a video first.
The aim of the Cultural Institute is to preserve and promote culture online, make it accessible to the world.
The launch of this new art project, which brings together the great museums across the world with Google.
To be on a platform where world's best galleries are all represented and the collections can be seen as a whole was really exciting.
We believe amazing things happen when art meets technology. What if we could help anyone in the world visit incredible places as if they were really there?
Everyone can profit from sharing information.
The internet has been incredibly important in the rise of street art.
It's amazing that through technology we are able to document everything.
This could become one of those fundamental instruments that all of us use.
Thank you for playing the videos. It just makes my job a little easier to explain what we do. So the Google Cultural Institute, very briefly, is actually a real European initiative that started by me and a few French engineers a couple of years ago as a hobby project when we used to work at Google in other areas. And our mission was to create, you could say, a single cultural market, a place where people can go for non-commercial purposes to really explore European museums, archives, and institutions. And so over the last 3.5 years, we've grown into this group within the company. We started as a startup, to be honest with you, and we've grown into this group that focuses on preserving and promoting access to art, history, and wonders of the world. And in the last 3.5, 4 years, I've had the privilege to personally visit around 300 European museums. It's been an honor to go and travel to various countries and actually talk to the directors of these museums, talk to the curators, and explain to them what can happen when you embrace digital and technology. And we are at 850 institutions worldwide right now, operating in around 61 countries. And it's all accessible on a single platform. Everything you saw on that video is freely accessible to anyone, irrespective of demographic or age barrier. And the application of this idea to have a unified digital approach to cultural heritage is starting to pay dividends now in an area that I care very passionately about, which is education. We have started to see what happens in classrooms, even if it doesn't matter what is the nature of funding of the institution. Through a simple internet connection on a laptop, they're able to take their students on these journeys, on these stories. Something simple we invented in 2011 was the ability to zoom right to the brushstrokes of masterpieces like Van Gogh, Rembrandt. For us, as geeks, we thought it was cool, but we didn't realize that actually for children and from an education standpoint, it just amplified the interest in art and culture. So we've been working recently with virtual reality. We've launched something called Google Cardboard, which was actually built by a French engineer in Paris. He is now, unfortunately, in the United States, but one part of him, his co-founder, is still in Paris. And that, I think, is a great example where we have managed to retain entrepreneurial people who are trying to find avenues of exposing cultural heritage through different technological mediums by giving them an opportunity to stay in Europe, continue working with European institutions. So I think, from my point of view, the idea to allow movement of digital assets, whether they are cultural or not, is a no-brainer. And we are starting to see the positive impacts of this. One of the biggest fears that we were told by putting all art, culture, heritage online is people will stop coming to museums. And it is good that we now use data to disprove these theories, because in the latest museum attendance figures released globally by the Art newspaper, museums that are doing a lot of digital activities are actually seeing significant growth in physical attendance. And I think the ones who really understood this very quickly have been the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and I work and meet a lot of these institutions, and the pace at which they're innovating with their cultural heritage assets is amazing. So I think there's a huge opportunity here in Europe to do even better and faster with more collaboration between cultural institutions, policymakers, and private partners. So I'm actually going to finish early by 50 seconds and give it to whoever else wants it.
Thank you so much, Amit. We'll move on to our next member of our panel, Franz Cordova. Very thrilled to have you, director of the US National Science Foundation and the former chief scientist of NASA. So a little bit of brain drain from the US to Europe for now, I would say.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My mic is on now. Great. Well, it's really exciting to be here on this this particular subject, because so much has changed in our lifetimes. I guess we're about to undergo still more revolutions in the digital era. When I was a graduate student, I actually did my thesis work on a batch computer. Anybody remember what that was, with punch cards? And desktops were just coming in to the laboratories at that time. So of course then we had the PC desktop revolution, and now we're just on the cusp of having everything in this one little device here. They promise by next year this will have as much computing power as, and some probably already do, as a computer on your desktop and be able to do everything that it could do. So one fun fact is that in our washing machines today, they're so smart. In fact, I try to avoid even using them because they're much smarter than I am. There's more computing power than there was on the Saturn V that took the Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon. Today, computing power is in our handbags and our back pockets, most appliances, and behind the healthcare we receive, and of course, helping us even in supermarket checkout lines. In fact, it's accelerating the pace of discovery and innovation in all fields of research. As Geert said, I am the director of the U.S. National Science Foundation, and we had a major role in the development of the internet. And I want to talk about that as an illustration of the main point that I'd like to make in my opening remarks, which is about the partnership between government and private enterprise and individuals, in whether they're in universities or just acting on their own. So if you just take the iPhone, for example, and it's a beautiful example, Amit, of art and design in that does science and discovery, that it has, at a minimum, 6 identifiable technologies, all of which were initially funded with government funding. For example, the touch screen was funded by my own agency to university researchers at 2 universities, Kentucky and Delaware. The CPU in this was funded by the Army, again to 2 different universities, Pennsylvania and Iowa State. The multi-core processors in here were funded by the Department of Defense to a Stanford University grant. The magnetic RAM, the Navy funded MIT. GPS was funded initially by DoD and NASA to Johns Hopkins University, and the battery by NSF to Oxford University and the University of Texas. Those were the very initial ones. Of course, many, many more developments took place before Apple and Steve Jobs got their hands on this and made it just a wonderful device that we all love to hold and use. In the 1980s, the National Science Foundation created and supported NSFNet, which initially linked together NSF-funded supercomputer centers and grew to include the broader academic community. So it was the bridge from the early ARPANET that was conceived of by Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf, who incidentally is a member of the board that governs the National Science Foundation, to what became the public internet. And in keeping with its educational mission, NSF has always been very proud to fund students who become our scientists and engineers. And one example is sitting on the podium today. The president of Estonia told me when he was 16 or 17 that NSF funded a grant for him at Columbia. Well, that was before you got to Columbia University. We also funded in the 1990s 2 young innovators, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, one as a graduate student fellow and the other in the Stanford Digital Library projects. And of course, they were the founders of what became Google, and the rest is history there. And NSF today is still funding basic research across the entire science and engineering spectrum. And we have a lot of investments, in particular, in fundamental cybersecurity and cyber-physical systems that include transition to practice as an option for our principal investigators. Researchers can apply for a grant above and beyond their initial grant if they promise to turn their research into accelerating the maturity of their research to industry. And those activities can include testing, development, and deployment efforts. Another example of what we do is to fund something called engineering research centers. We now have 19 of them. We just opened a new one at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign last week. It is a center for the power optimization of electrothermal systems. It's going to conduct research aimed at producing lighter, more efficient power electronic systems, again, all digital, for cars, planes, construction equipment, and handheld tools, and save billions of dollars in fuel costs. All of these engineering centers have their own applications. All of them use cyber and cyber infrastructure and cybersecurity systems. And it shows how academic and public and private sectors can come together to solve problems and push innovation forward. And there's one more example that I'd like to tell you about, because it's really revolutionizing the way education is being taught, especially in our graduate schools. About 4 years ago, we started a program called the Innovation Corps, or I-Corps for short. And this program takes graduate students with their faculty mentors and industry representatives from local industries and really tries to speed up the translation of discoveries to the marketplace by doing real market research. So you'll find engineering and science colleges working with our business colleges on this effort. I-Corps teaches what a researcher needs to know about how to be engaged in industry, whether the discovery that he or she has made has any market potential. And this really gets our discoveries into the marketplace faster. It's become so popular that NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the Department of Energy have both copied it. And we brought it last May to the country of Mexico. They have copied it. And only a month ago, the state of Ohio. So now it's going state to state. I understand my time is up, but I hope that I've given you an illustration that the government and universities, private individuals, and industry can all work together successfully to keep moving the digital era forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I must say it's refreshing to hear Americans defend a bigger government, but that's an interesting perspective. Our final member on the panel, Marietje Schaake, is a member of the European Parliament and on the Global Commission for Internet Governance. Let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Of course, I find myself in a very difficult position to speak after a tech-savvy president, an entrepreneur, someone representing one of the most successful tech companies and a pioneer in science and innovation. And so not only do I come from a world where apparently people are unaware of what 2 to the third means, also people don't always know the difference between a server and a waiter. And even though it can be quite funny to you know, criticize politicians, it's a popular thing to do these days, I would like to ask your appreciation for the genuine challenge of the rapid development of technologies and the inevitable slower pace of democratic decision-making. This is really a challenge. Bringing in knowledge to the policy level is, but also how to keep up with these rapid developments and to make sure that on the one hand we enable entrepreneurship and innovation, but on the other hand we embed it in a framework of principles. And this is where I think Europe should lead by developing smart policies that also take into consideration the public interest. Because as we look at the digital environment and the development of a digital economy, I think it is fair to say that companies are often the new sovereigns, and that we may not have to expect that companies act in the public interest. They have, of course, a profit goal. I think it is important to keep this bigger perspective in mind. Now, we are at a moment in time where another important Estonian, Commissioner Ansip, has proposed digital single market package. And it is certainly worth pursuing because the potential value could run into the hundreds of billions of euros. But I think we must see it only as a starting point. And the ideas that are now at the table are quite practical, and I believe that Europe has not quite made a real choice yet to develop a vision of where it wants to be in space and time, and to act accordingly. I still feel like a real sense of urgency of, for example, wishing to make Europe the smartest continent on Earth is lacking. We see this because there has been virtually no change in European funds being spent on agricultural subsidies instead of the knowledge economy. We see this in mainly member state policies choosing incumbents over innovators over and over again, in favoring the existing copyright system or spectrum auctions or geo-blocking. There's many examples of how incumbents hinder the development of the many talents and entrepreneurs that Europe have in reaching their audiences, in celebrating the diversity that we also have. And I think it's rooted in a broader problem of a perceived national interest being at odds with a bigger global vision. I'm afraid it's not only in the digital sphere that we see this. We recently were dealing with the telecom single market, where indeed I was one of those people who do believe that Europe should lead in enshrining the principle of net neutrality in very clear terms in EU law. And we have now been overtaken by the United States against initial expectations in embedding net neutrality, but also when it comes to spectrum auctions, member states were unwilling to move. And if the way in which a telecom single market was dealt with is any prediction for the future, we're going to have a very hard and frustrating time in implementing the digital single market plans. By the way, those who say that the digital single market plans are in any way digital protectionism, as even President Obama suggested, I think are wrong. We need to harmonize our policies in Europe, and removing barriers within our single market, also online, is also going to benefit international companies, including American ones. Now, I'll conclude by saying that I think we have to look far beyond practical solutions that are now at the table. We need to look at the entire ecosystem if we want to enable a digital single market in Europe and more entrepreneurship and innovation as a result. We should look at why there is not more encouragement of taking risk and teaching young people how to be entrepreneurial and also rewarding that. We have to look at how startups can get access to capital, which is a different world, but very, very important, and one of the reasons why so many successful startups leave for the United States. We should adapt our education curriculum to make sure that we foster the skills, including coding, from a very young age. And I believe it is key that we don't only look at what needs to change within Europe, but that we also look at the global perspective around issues of governance. Technology is a layer of so many areas of policy making. It is not a topic we can address, and we have to also look at how it impacts foreign policy, security policy, and questions of governance, where I think altogether Europe has a number of key ingredients, has the credibility, has the position to be leading in setting norms and creating a perfect ecosystem, but it requires a more explicit political choice that I have not seen made yet, unfortunately.
Since Mariette didn't want to touch it, I'll mention one more big elephant in the room for which we don't have much time to solve. I will mention only briefly, but the finding by the European Court of Justice that the Safe Harbor Act is in violation of the treaties. Leaving aside the whole issue of privacy that is in there, it is the ruling, we fear, will lead to the point where even the much vaunted Internet of Things in your whatever, your refrigerator or your thermostat, it may be in trouble, because if data can't cross national borders, this could really be a big problem. If you think about if your data can only be your own national data, then you're going to have a problem driving across borders with a self-driving car. Because, or even if it's not a self-driving car, but it is, as with a Tesla, is constantly feeding data back and forth. What do you do in a Europe where you have 28 countries? I mean, there could be some real messes in that. So that requires work in the next 2 months if you want something that's really immediate. And the negotiations between the European Commission and the United States government on this really, I hope, will succeed in this, because it will otherwise stymie our development even more.
Right. So we're ready to jump to the floor. Who wants to go first? We've heard a lot of topics, wide variety. Sir?
Sergio Orzeni. Marietje Schaake was very right to point to the importance of speed and governance. One of the main problems in Europe is that the program Horizon 2020 has increased the budget, but the way in which the budget is managed has not changed. And so you can increase, the question is not the money, but the way in which, in Israel, there is the office of the chief scientist that can give, with the real scientists, that can give $100,000 in 2 weeks' time if they deem that a proposal is valid. In Europe, it will take 2 years. And in the digital economy, in the knowledge economy, this is biblical time frame. So that is the most urgent thing, that to change the governance and to accelerate the speed in which, apart from the fact that Mrs. Schaake rightly said that Europe has ways thrown out of the windows billions of euros by funding dinosaurs, incumbents, instead of giving money to newcomers. Thank you.
Anyone on the panel? No? Yeah? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Lindsay Nefesh-Clark, European and British, and I'm living in Paris, and I founded a crowdfunding platform for the protection of girls and women's human rights and girls and women's empowerment. I wanted to ask a question about the Grand Coalition for Digital Jobs. So I know this was one of the initiatives which is said to be one of the largest collaborative multi-stakeholder initiatives for addressing, say, the skills gap and fostering digital skills. At this stage, so we're a couple of years down the line, have we measured the impact of that?
Anyone?
I don't think so. I have to say it was an initiative by Commissioner Kroes, the previous Commissioner for the Digital Agenda, where I believe her main goal was also to do something against youth unemployment, which remains a major problem, and where we also see in practice what the lack of appropriate skills means, because we have nearly 1 million vacancies in the IT sector, which are unfilled despite youth unemployment that is at very scary rates. So we have to do more to also ensure that mobility remains in Europe. The free movement of people is under pressure on another side, but I agree entirely with President Ilves that if the climate for diversity becomes more under pressure and people feel less free in our European capitals and hubs, then for innovation and entrepreneurship, but also for the free flow of people, it's going to be a lot more difficult. In the European Parliament, we've been working, because education is most of all a member state competence these days in Europe, but we have been working on unifying the qualification mechanism so that it's at least easier for people to indicate what skills they have, no matter what European country they go to. But it's a good point to measure the impact of this grand coalition on digital jobs. Thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you. I had a hand there, yeah.
I'm Birgitte Andersen, the CEO of the Big Innovation Center. I want to comment on that the problem I think we have in Europe is not startups. There are plenty of startups everywhere. London is packed with startups, and so is every other city almost in Europe. The problem is scale-ups. And I want to comment how our entrepreneurial ecosystem in Europe is so different from United States and of course Silicon Valley. So for example, in Europe, investment in intangibles such as computerized information, IP, patents, copyright, brands, networks, business processes, etc., is now doubled that of investment in physical assets like buildings, machinery, raw material. In terms of value added to gross domestic product, it's also double, and in terms of the valuation of companies, it's many, many, many more times that of physical value. Just for IBM, 11 times more, and for SMEs, the same. The problem is that when banks try to value companies for finance, they're only measuring the physical assets, but the high-growth companies got 75% more of the intangibles on the balance sheet than than the rest. If you go to the United States, the way in which they value companies is different. They're looking at the intangibles as well, Silicon Valley Bank and many of the other new banks. Also, if we look at venture capitalists, in Europe, we don't have the same venture capitalists as we have in the United States. So therefore, it's very, very important that instead of importing them from China and from America, we actually develop a system we can use. And if we don't have the VCs, our banks and our crowdsourcing associations needs to step up. So that was one aspect. The other aspects I want to comment on is the digital single market. I've been pushing for that so much several times in Europe's world and other places. I believe that when I was rapporteur for the European Commission on open innovation and knowledge transfer, they're focusing a lot on security. The data, we need to start with the value the big data can create and then create an infrastructure. Of course, everybody agrees on security, but we need to look at a charter on how data can be used rather than something locking them down on how they cannot be used.
Thank you.
Brigitte brings up a couple of very good points, and it's true, it's very much different in the US. We have a thriving venture capital. It is very concentrated in certain areas, though, so that's a concern, is how to spread it throughout the country. That's one of our challenges. But you've given me a different idea, and I was pleased to have dinner with Brigitte last night, so we got to talk about this a lot. And that's that now our countries and many more have started 3 years ago a global research council, which is just an ad hoc group, but we meet once a year all together in a different country every time. First one was in the US, but now many other countries, including the second one was in Bremen. And this is the heads of all the research funding institutions get together. And there's real opportunity in this last idea that you said about big data to really talk about what our models are, to share that information. We've picked out various subjects like open access to data, that's been a past one, and learned a lot from each other's models, merit review and so forth. And this year, in fact, in India, it's going to be on women and the question of women in science and engineering and how to draw more into that. But this subject that you just brought up at the end would be a very good one for us to take up and share what we do. And I also agree with the previous comment about scaling. In fact, the new word at my agency is how to scale the very good things that exist one by one as kind of boutique efforts and are just doing great work in a small area, but others don't know about them, and how do we scale them?
Thanks. Next question, Andre?
Thank you. I was just about to say that the word which was missing in this discussion was the word scaling, because without repeating what has been said, what we forget a bit is that we are more and more in a technology world, and that technology only, I'm speaking as an investor, only works out and plays out also profitably if you have the certain scale. Look at the amount of money that you need to develop a medicine. Even a game today, you need between $10 and $50 million to make a good game. So it's a big capex. So I have two questions. One is for France. We are about to launch, or we are launching this famous Juncker plan, 315 billion euro. I would like to have your view, especially when I heard you about these 6 technologies that are now on the iPhone, which were funded. We're talking a lot about infrastructure, pipeline, airports, bridges. What is your take? How should we, if you were in our shoes, how we should use the money that is ready to be deployed in Europe? And a question to Marietje, great to have you on the panel. You talked a lot about the democratic process, and I'm completely with you, but we also know that the world is accelerating. The volatility is accelerating. So the problem you're mentioning is just going to get worse. What would be the one recommendation that we need to change from a decision-making process, which allows still that, because we all know the worst decision is not to take one. And with data privacy, that's exactly where we are right now in Europe. There's no scale. There are 28 different, so it's impossible for a startup to scale up because the agency cost to do it in Europe. So you rather go to China, even if China is very complicated, or to the US, which is not less complicated either. So if we can have these two.
Thank you.
Well, on the first one, and then I'll pass it. So The way you do infrastructure has also changed a lot, of course, in the last couple of decades, and cyber infrastructure has taught us much about our networks and how old-fashioned some of them are. So we are actually experimenting with different models for networks. And I won't say any more. I'd really like to talk to who's ever interested about that. But one example is if you go online to our agency and look up the nanotechnology initiative, we are doing that with a whole host of different smaller networks, all networked through a backbone structure. And so you just have to keep experimenting and be flexible enough to do that.
I fully understand the need to be able to scale, but I also observe that there are other barriers in Europe that will remain a challenge for us, such as language, for example, which will inevitably make it more difficult to roll out one service across 28 member states than it would be in the same kind of space in the United States. So it's something we have to think about, how we're going to manage that. Maybe technological solutions of real-time translation will help, but I still see that there are some differences between us. You talked about sort of what's the one thing that should happen to make decision-making quicker. I mean, I could come up with some easy ones on sort of governance level, and making an end to vetoes and things like that would certainly help. On the other hand, I think bringing in, I was not really kidding when I made my introductions. I think there's a real lack of appreciation of the rapid development of technologies, a real lack of knowledge, and it's very hard to make smart policies if people who make those decisions cannot even conceive of what's already possible. And so maybe starting like a geek hub in the European institutions could be something that you, as people who are more in the entrepreneurship and investment field, could think about. It would also be good if more entrepreneurs would run for office, because there is a tendency for bureaucrats to seek political office, and I think more diversity there and more experience on the ground would be great. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm sure there's more than one idea out there.
On the investment side, and then I'll give the floor to Giles, but I just want to say, about 5 years ago, I was asked by Neelie Kroes to chair the European Commission task force on e-health. And we thought the whole thing would be about technology, and we discovered very quickly it was all about law. Basically, if you have the right laws, the right legal framework in place, you can see huge developments in e-health. But it has to do with things like data ownership. Who owns the data? That's, it's a fundamental and basic aspect of healthcare, but anything else. But we discovered that the kinds of things we needed to be able to do, for example, transfer data across borders, if you want to have a pan-European system that works, or even with, in our case right now, we have a digital prescription in which no one uses paper prescriptions anymore in my country. You can go to any pharmacy, stick in your chip card and put in your code, and you get what has been prescribed to you. But in order for that to work across a border, we have to do a lot of changes in law elsewhere. So I mean, the thing, it's not simply just funding smart people and laying a lot of fiber all over. You also need to really approach the legal framework that we're operating in, which is often really designed for the 19th century. And I would just conclude that with that. Once you go digital, you can actually speed things up a lot, not because, because you finally can get away from the 5,000-year tradition of serial processing via paper. Because as long as you live in a paper world, the paper goes to one ministry, to one department, another department, a third department, another ministry, whereas you can do all these things in parallel if you're sufficiently digitized, if you have a secure identity and you have the right architecture. But again, in order to do that, you also need the legal framework that enables you to do all of that, and then you can speed up. And I think I have to give the floor to Giles, who's had his hand up for a while.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I was very struck by France Cordova's example of the iPhone. It reminded me that, what was it, about 15 years ago, the Americans were nowhere mobile phones. We'd established the GSM standard, and a wonderful new era seemed to be opening up in front of us. And then I listened to France running through the universities. I heard one European university, and it's a bit semi-detached because it was Oxford. My question is this, well, I have two questions. Are we doomed to slip back further and further and further and become a bit like going back to your iPhone, a bit like Lenovo, who make them in Shenzhen, and they reckon to hang on to 15 cents in the dollar of every iPhone sold. The rest goes to American, European marketing, whatever. So first question, are we doomed? Second question, does it matter? In a globalized world, does it really matter? Just two questions.
Who is we?
Sorry, you're in Brussels. You're in Brussels, Professor. We is the Europeans.
Are you doomed because the technology is being developed elsewhere faster? Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah, that's
No, I'm asking.
Oh, you're asking. Well, I only see opportunity. I never see doom. And I think you have some of the best minds in universities, young people in the world are just all around you, and they're just really worth investing in. I think the model that has made science and technology so successful in the US, and it just keeps, more and more discoveries keep being made all the time, is because we invest in our universities. Our budget, by the way, is almost $7.5 billion a year, and we invest 85% of that. 85% goes right into the universities. And the result is 217 Nobel Prizes have been funded by NSF Research, and a lot of other discoveries that they won't let me have the time to talk about. But the point is that if you just trust, you have a merit review system and you trust in really great ideas, you have a mechanism for getting money out the door quickly, and you just have no strings attached, and you don't have the expectation that this will turn into a Google or a Microsoft or some other company. It just does. And I will also note for The Economist here that the last 52, including this year's prizes and Nobel Prizes in economics, were also funded. NSF gave funding for those. So this is a model that works, is to give the money to university groups and centers and research institutes.
Thank you. There are a lot of hands, but I think the gentleman next to Mr. Gilles is first, yeah? And then in the back. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Joost Vanniers of the European Economic and Social Committee. Besides the bad news you have already eloquently set out, I would mention two things which are today very much important. First, education is not a European competence, and the European Commission is very reluctant to enter in that subject, wrongly so, in my view. And the second point is that until recently, the Commission itself was also confused about what was all going on. And one saw in Connect, Move, Internal Market, DG Enterprise, DG Employment, R&D, and digital agenda, all sorts of activities which were not connected among themselves. The good news, however, is that this is changing. Oettinger has been nominated as coordinating the 4.0 revolution, which is extremely important, as it is bound to cheer up European industry. And in education, we should encourage the Commission to set the agenda. I have one question in this field to France, and that is, you were mentioning a number of initiatives in the States on the issue, well coordinated, but always the Ministry of Defense or the Army or the Marine is included. We have no European defense, and actually everybody running out of money. How do you, how can we imagine that similar initiatives are being set up in Europe without having the strong support of an institute like the Pentagon? Thank you.
I would suggest the DARPA and ARPA-E models to look at those, okay? That's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which has developed a lot of, they developed the technologies obviously for defense, but after a while then they go public, and many of the things, you know, I mentioned the GPS example, many things that have started in defense then are liberated, opened up for the public. And so the Department of Energy about 6 or 7 years ago, copied them, but in a much more open sphere called ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. So it's a separate branch. It's separately managed. The head of that reports to the Secretary for Energy, but it just invests in really extreme research at the boundary, at the cutting edge, and the country believes that that's a good investment. And so those are just models that I would say are ones to work with defense. I mean, if you look at what they've actually produced, especially DARPA, because it's much older, then you'll just see very significant discoveries.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm happy the education point of view when we talk about digital agenda has already developed.
Could you identify yourself?
Remus Pricopie, I'm a former Minister of Education from Romania and now Rector of National University of Political Studies. And I speak from my experience as a Minister of Education because I see a big risk. On one hand, we have the research, development, the commercial dimension of digital agenda, but on the other hand, we have to ask ourselves if population, generally speaking, and also kids, young generations, they are prepared for the digital world. Last year, as a ministerial, here in Brussels, it was a ministerial council, and the digital subject was there. And what I've seen there was big differences in understanding the process at the level of ministers of education, that means at the level of the countries, and also big gap in policies. So the question is, are we going to build a new gap in Europe, the digital gap from the point of view of kids, that means the future adults of Europe? And also, in addition to this, are we able, at the European level or at the national level, to keep the same speed in policy term with the speed of developments in the digital agenda? And I'm very happy Marietta touched the issue of curriculum. We have already big differences in curriculum at the primary level related to understanding ICT. So the question is if we are doing everything in terms of preparing the young generation to face the future digital society. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try to come back to a few questions that were asked. I would like to remind everyone that the reason why Europe cannot deal with education policy should be sought in the capitals. It's enormous frustration, but if we cross the line, let's say, we immediately get sort of slapped on the wrist because of subsidiarity. And increasingly,
But do you agree?
Yes, and I mentioned it, I think, in my introductory remarks, but absolutely I agree. I think we need to have much more of a global perspective and a sense of urgency in creating one European sphere, including when it comes to skills and opportunities. So yes, I absolutely agree, but I want to make sure that it's clear which door to knock if you want change. Then I don't want to be so pessimistic about Europe. Giles, this is not only for you, but really, I mean, recently I was at CERN. You know, we can be proud of these kinds of institutions in Europe, and I think we have so much knowledge and talent also in the academic institutions. We may just have to specialize a bit more and make choices in terms of where we want hubs of specific expertise instead of, well, having, let's say, too many players in a small part of the world competing with each other. Then I would like to mention something else. We've talked about the role of government in the United States, and of course it's very exciting what is happening in terms of fostering science and innovation. But we've also seen the government of the United States play a different role. The fact that the NSA has really overstepped the boundaries has eroded a lot of trust and has had a high price for Silicon Valley. And I think that Europe may well, and nobody can predict the future, but may well have a competitive advantage here. And that in a couple of years we will see that stronger safeguards of fundamental rights and freedoms will actually be rewarding also in the business sense. I also think that less inequality between people in Europe is something that we cherish, and education is not always as accessible for everyone in the US at top level. At least it's very expensive. So let us not be too depressed here and look at solutions of how we can use the best practices in Europe, and I think this could also be part of the answer in terms of what should happen in policy. If we could make the best practices of each member state leading, we would already get quite far, instead of always seeking a common denominator between everybody, which tends to, you know, pull the average outcome down too much.
I admire your optimism in terms of privacy issues, but that's good. The gentleman here.
Yeah, my name is Walter Weigel. I am the manager of the 1,200 researchers working for Huawei Technologies here in Europe. And you mentioned that 20 of the biggest IT companies are based in the US and 6 in China, so I'm working for one of them. And I want to come back to an example with the phone. So this is actually a Chinese phone, and you would be surprised how much European technology is in this phone. Why? Because we have here in Europe excellent talent, excellent know-how, excellent researchers. I think the question is much more, why are we not able to bring this into products, into services, into revenue? And my recommendation would be not to run behind the things which are lost, but we have, for instance, excellent startups dealing with wearables. We have a very strong, what we call vertical industry, from Industry 4.0, smart grid, e-health, intelligent traffic systems, you name them, and to look into their digitalization, at least be a leader here. And then I liked very much the example about the funding of excellent research in the US. So our main project is Horizon 2020. And I'm making this comment every time. I'm not sure whether we are walking the talk, because we have 70 billion for the whole program. This leads to a success rate of the last call of 14%. So we're wasting 7 out of 8 very long-term manpower investment of researchers. We are just wasting them into the bin. And then you mentioned agricultural fund. I can look into structural funds, which are a multitude of the 70 billion. And now I'm talking as a German passport holder. I recently learned that my chancellor, out of the blue, without planning, for whatever purposes, found 6 billion out of the budget without increasing taxes, which is 10% of our research budget. And so I really ask myself, now more coming to the president and the member of parliament, to our politicians, what are we doing to get somehow the balance right? Thank you.
Well, I don't know. We seem to be doing okay on a rather low budget in Estonia, but I would certainly say that we really do. I mean, the discussion on education is also crucial. I mean, one of the reasons why we have one of the things we do is we start early. And my own experience, I learned to program in BASIC at age 13, and I was programming, that was 48 years ago, you can do the math. And I learned, and 43 years ago, I was programming a PDP-8, and if you know what that is, that really shows your age, in assembler language. I mean, I'm not a geek. I just know how to do it. But I mean, that means you teach children at an early age, and it doesn't really require that much money. And then you will see the effects shortly.
Right, there were a couple of hands in the back.
I'm Žiga Turk. I'm the former Minister of Slovenia for Education, Science, Information Society, etc. And I wrote a little piece on the triage of the digital single market for the Europe's world, the last issue. My question to the panel is the following. Is it a mistake that we are speaking, that we have a session about digital as a separate session? Isn't the sliding back in digital just a symptom that we have basically outdated social model, outdated economic model, outdated legal model, and that the digital is just the area where these things show the most, but there are other areas where we are sliding back for these reasons as well?
The short answer is yes. Anyone wants to jump in on that one, or?
I would say quickly, one reason you ultimately should never have a minister for IT is that then everyone pushes their own problems off on you and says that's his problem. And the issue really is that you have to have everything, all ministries in governance, and so too, I think all of the DGs should be constantly dealing with the digital issue in each of their areas and being up on the latest possibilities. And unless you do that, then it's always going to be just one DG that's IT, and as soon as there's an issue, you just say, oh, it's their problem, let UNZIP deal with it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one thing I would say, I'm quite an outsider to this group, and one thing I would say is from a technology standpoint, I think, the reason why there's a rapid development or acceleration of technology, which everyone seems to be a bit scared of, but actually I don't think you need to be scared of if you are agile. And the reason why things have moved so fast is because programmers have moved to a different model of programming. It's agile development. Everything moves in a different way. And unfortunately, the other core pillars of society are not as agile. So you have one group that is moving extremely fast and the others that are still debating and discussing, while the agile group continues to just keep moving. So maybe we debate a little less.
Thank you. I had a hand there. Yeah.
Eero Ailio, European Commission, DG Energy. Good morning. My question is actually about the topic that we haven't discussed yet here, patents. We're talking about how to scale up, how to speed up innovation and make it easier. This is usually the patent processes and the costs involved on that, legal, etc., are something that slows down things. It's a kind of a minefield in many cases, and you have situations where you have companies with certain technologies who file these submarine patents just to sort of keep competitors off from developing that. Well, why is this a problem? It becomes a problem when you start to need to actually integrate different technologies which already exist and create new solutions in smart technologies particularly. So should this be the time to revamp the patent system? And I just, at one point on that, there was a article, I think, on this in The Economist at one point where they compared the R&D budgets of the pharma industry towards, compared that against the budgets for the legal litigations related to patent wars between the companies, and found out indeed that the legal side was actually several times higher, plus also, of course, the royalty part. So perhaps it's gone too far. So what do you think about this?
Cordova?
Oh, well, our system is so much different, but we have our problems, and it's just huge. And as you said, in some fields, like anything with in health, biotechnology, it's got many more challenges than some other fields. But we're working very hard. The head of Michelle Lee, the head of our patent office, working with Congress. A lot of these things are legislative. They're in law, so you need to get the lawyers really together and figuring out ways to be a lot more flexible with invention. But I'm sure your patent challenges are a little bit different than ours, so I'd like to hear about them.
Do you want?
Well, just briefly, I mean, I think that those patent wars have gotten out of hand at times, and it also favors incumbents who can pay for lawyers, who can challenge the competitors instead of, making available, particularly in the digital sphere, some of these technologies in a more open manner. It also costs a lot of money for governments, by the way, that they are in locking contracts, which are not necessarily even creating more resilient systems when it comes to security. So yes, I think it is time for rethink in the broader sense. I was looking at your clip on digitizing cultural heritage, and was reminding myself of the Europeana program, which is an EU program which sought to do the same. But if you look at, if you could have a graphic display of which years have been digitized in terms of European cultural heritage, you will see a black hole at sort of the first half of the previous century, because copyright terms are so long, life plus 70 years, that even though we have very rich and attractive and diverse and beautiful content in our archives, they cannot be digitized because the rights holders cannot be found and paid. And so we have to ask ourselves, does this system still serve the original purposes it was created for? Because the times have changed. So if at the time where the copyright laws were drafted, the printing press was just invented, and it was intended to protect the authors from the monopolies of the printers, this is not the time we live in anymore. We have shifted from a time of scarcity to a time of abundance, particularly digitally. You can copy and share indefinitely without a loss of quality and increase of much costs. So we have to rethink, and this also goes to Professor Turk's question, rethink some of the structures along which we still work. In Dutch we have an expression, de wet van de remmende voorsprong, which I think in English is something like the law of lagging advantage. I mean, because we have such advanced structures, they can also become heavy in terms of governance, in terms of laws, in terms of process, where if you are a newcomer without, as we've seen in, for example, African countries, there have never been landline phones. There was an immediate jump to mobile. And we have to dare to rethink and challenge the incumbents if these structures make us less agile.
Okay, we have time for about 3 more questions. Gentlemen here.
My name is Koen Teulings, Merifian Capital Private Equity. The question was, does it really matter whether we lag behind or should we be catching up? And I would say not necessarily, because there is a lot of strengths in Europe in different fields, a lot of invention, a lot of entrepreneurial activity already. Other areas we are not that good. A lot can be done in order to facilitate processes, but are we in such a bad shape? I think not at all. Actually, lots of initiatives, inventions that are made here in Europe can be developed in other areas. I don't think we should say that we have to catch up with the United States or with anyone. Be just European, and when you have something that is worthwhile, develop it further in the best place that you can find, be it in Asia or in the US or in European countries. Don't be so terrified by we have to catch up with the United States.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There?
Yes, thank you. Nathalie Noguered, I'm a member of the editorial board of The Guardian. Thank you for great contributions to this debate. I think I have a very straightforward question, which is President Ilves was very clear that there is a very large cost to the fragmented digital world which Europe is, the fact we don't have a digital union. So my question is, why? I mean, why don't we have a digital union? Could you identify what in your mind is the main obstacle to this? Is it the usual difficulty to coordinate among the 28 members? Is it vested interests which cross over those borders? And 2 thoughts on that. I was talking recently with the representative of a big Silicon Valley company who said, oh, the digital union in Europe is being floated as an idea to just to give David Cameron, some kind of result in his negotiation. So I just wanted to float, just bounce this off you. And the second thought I wanted to share is that I represent a media organization, and I think the digital union is not just about business and opening up new business opportunities. It's also about the European debate that we need, and especially concerning young people. And if there is a digital union, media organizations that care about Europe and a European debate and breaking out of the national silos, which we are severely suffering from, these media organizations would be able to plug into those revenues, the revenues that you can draw from a single digital market. Thanks.
Well, I can tell you, at least from our perspective, it's certainly not in any way connected to David Cameron. We prefer the term the digital single market because we do have the Single Market Act, and the problem is that those what's possible, what has been so wonderful for Europe with the Single Market Act, it does not work in the digital sphere, and also, unfortunately, there is. I mean, to say what are the stumbling blocks? There seems to be an innate aversion, especially among certain large industrial countries, to free movement of services. And what we're talking about, so you can buy something across a border, is the free movement of a service. But there is such strong opposition. I mean, there was when I was in the European Parliament 10 years ago, we voted on what was the emasculated Bolkestein liberalization. And even water services could not move across borders at an age when a French company, I believe, was buying our work because we have free movement of capital. You can buy another country's water service, but you couldn't provide service across a border. Forbidden. Now, and water is fairly analog, I would say. Digital is more complex. Other stumbling blocks precisely is that, I mean, there are when we talk about the copyright regimes, this is a distinct disadvantage for small countries. You might want to do something. A service might go and work through all the nasty, difficult work that you have to do for Germany or France or in Italy because you've got sufficient markets there. But we noticed in the case of, say, iTunes, again, they did not even come into Eastern Europe until 7 years after they. I mean, we were all in the European Union, but iTunes wasn't in the eastern part because they just didn't really want to bother with all these countries with different copyright regimes. The other thing is cross-border VAT. VAT is always a difficult issue, though I would argue the solution there is in digitization, because we do in my country between Finland and Estonia real-time VAT. So the solutions lie there as well. So, I mean, those are the fundamental issues. It's copyright and taxation, and then there is the general sort of aversion to the idea of free movement of services. That's my perspective. I don't know, Mariette deals with it at the European Parliament. She could probably add 2 cents.
Thank you. No, just very briefly, I understand the opportunities for media companies, but also want to point out to their active resistance to change. Geo-blocking of content, as one example. I, as a Dutch taxpayer, cannot watch online the evening news of my own funded public broadcasting online here in Belgium because of geo-blocking. If I myself am interviewed by the BBC, I cannot watch myself online. And these are media companies who believe, I think falsely, that to contain their content to a territorially based audience is an advantage, which I really don't understand, particularly not for English language media. I think that there is nothing lost if Dutch pensioners in Spain can watch online their own tax-paid content. And so starting with making available that content which is publicly funded, whether it's in science or in media or in culture, would be a huge help towards facilitating innovation and towards reaping the benefits of digitization. And I think media companies themselves could be a huge help to push policy in that direction instead of resisting against it.
Thank you. I have the frustrating job to disappoint anyone who still has hands up. We've reached the end of our very interesting session, but I suggest anyone who wants to continue the discussion over coffee break, do so. We start again at 5 to 4, and there is the session Making Europe's Neighborhood Safe Again. That's here at the Arenberg room, and then Defining Europe's Infrastructural Challenges is at the library downstairs. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the great panel, and see you after the coffee break.
Secretary. Yes. Well, I was his boss.